What's for you won't pass you by Sylvester. Once I became aware of the scarecrow, I could think of nothing else. It was a few weeks after the harvest, approaching Halloween, and one of the children had carved him a pumpkin for a head. I yelled at them for wasting good food, but they lied to my face, and they said they hadn't done a thing, so I refused them supper. My wife argued, saying that they were good children, honest children. I replied that all people get the things that they deserve, and when she protested, I yelled at her too until she began to cry. I tried to comfort her, but she shrugged off my arm. I glanced up and glimpsed the pumpkin face at the edge of the field. The leering, jeering, moon-faced scarecrow watched me through the window. He'd seen it all. I marched outside, snatched the pumpkin from the pole and tossed it into the corn stubble. Next morning, the head was back on the stick. Some vermin had nibbled at the pumpkin overnight, so his smile was a little wider, his eyes withered in the corners. He was even more mocking than before. I simmered at the defiance, but if it meant that much to the children, then so be it. I swallowed it down and set about my work in the fields. When I come home that night, someone had moved the scarecrow out of the field and into the yard, even closer to home. He was only 20 paces away, tilted at an angle, the head looking lopsidedly into the kitchen window. Again, my children insisted they had nothing to do with it. No one else had been to the farm that day, so I whipped them both as liars. One stroke of the belt across the palm of the hand and sent them to bed. My wife begged me not to, but I shrugged her off, reminding her again that what's for you won't pass you by. As the children whimpered their way upstairs, some nonsense dragged my eyes to the window. That damn scarecrow. He was watching. I drew my finger across my throat. You'd have thought that was warning enough, but over the next few days, the scarecrow shuffled himself closer to my house, further into my life, creeping by inches into my family. I shouted at the children. I threatened them with a belt. They sobbed and hid, and my wife begged me to leave them be. I cursed them all as wretches and ate my meals alone. A week or so later, I woke in the night and glanced out the bedroom window. The scarecrow stood barely 10 feet from the house. The head was no longer lopsided. It was looking up at the bedroom. It was looking up at me. My children had been locked into their rooms. My wife was fast asleep. I understood then that they had been telling me the truth. I walked downstairs and outside, and the wind hissed through the corn stubble. We stood in front of the scarecrow and remembered things my grandmother had taught me. She taught me about the little folk. She taught me to leave crumbs on the hearth and on the doorstep. She taught me about due rewards. She taught me that what's for you won't pass you by. As I stood in thought, the head slipped round to stare at me. I nodded once, very well then, and fetched my hatchet and smashed the pumpkin to pieces. The seeds sprayed out and rancid liquid splashed at my ankles. I returned to bed and slept fitfully, dreaming of a cavernous pumpkin head with empty holes that watched without blinking, vast and empty sockets that had no eyes to see. I woke late. Indeed, I'd slept all day through, for the The sun had set and gloaming stirred the fields. I moved to curse my wife, but then understood that I was no longer in the house. I stood around 10 feet from the kitchen window, looking in. I could not move. I was cold and stiff, as though a winter's worth of bad backs had fallen on me all at once. My skull felt bulbous, split open to the sky. I tried to talk, and my tongue was glue in the roof of my mouth. I looked up then and saw what the scarecrow had seen. My wife sat alone at the table, all the sadness of the world carved into her face. I wanted to shout to her, to let her know I was safe, to say that I was right here, right here. But my teeth were fused, and my voice was no more than the lisping of the wind in the corn. Panic snipped at me. Someone was approaching the house. He walked close by me, pausing for a heartbeat, and then continued and stepped up to the front door. He raised a hand to knock, but then lowered it. He let himself in. His silhouette crossed into the hallway. I tried to shout to warn my wife and found I could not make any sound at all. The man stepped into the kitchen, his back to the window. I couldn't see his face. He stood behind my wife. He laid a hand upon her shoulder and slid it round to her neck. She started in alarm and looked up, but before she could react, he stooped low and kissed her on the mouth. It was a long kiss, a deep kiss. And when he stood upright, he'd left something on my wife's face. I couldn't remember when I'd seen it last. It was a smile. She was smiling. I tried to clench my hand into a fist, but my fingers wouldn't respond. I flicked them all I could, but the bones only creaked and stiffened into twigs, broomstick hands for a broomstick man. I tried to pull myself from the pole and found that I was the pole. My feet were buried in the soil, in the cold and the wet, and the legion beasts of the earth set about my bones. Breeze whispered through the sockets of my head. The man looked outside, and he looked at me. I saw his face. He looked like me, but he was not me. He was a better man than me. Looking into the window was like looking into a mirror, but a better mirror. And I thought, as I looked at him, yes, it's true what they say. What's for you won't ever pass you by.